Climbing stairs leaves you winded. 3 o'clock hits and your brain shuts down. Your doctor called it aging. He's wrong. You sleep, you eat right, you do what you're told, and the exhaustion is still there, every day. Every appointment ends the same. That's normal for your age. It isn't. The CDC's National Health and Aging Study, 2026, Medicare beneficiaries over 60, found that daily physical vitality loss is the #1 non-fatal complaint in Americans your age. Not joint pain, not sleep, energy. And molecular research in the same report ties it directly to mitochondrial failure. In this video, I'll show you the cellular mechanism behind that exhaustion, why it's measurable, and 3 validated protocols that can start restoring your energy starting this week. This hourglass right here is the most accurate metaphor I've found for what happens to your energy after 60. Not because your time is running out, but because the mechanism that generates your energy is, quietly, measurably, losing the ability to hold its charge. The CDC's National Health and Aging Study collected data directly from Medicare beneficiaries in 2026, and when researchers looked at the primary non-fatal complaint across Americans over 60, across joint pain, sleep disturbance, memory concerns, balance issues, the top answer was not what most people expect. It was this: the daily loss of physical vitality, energy, the thing your doctor probably called aging. I'm James Reyes. I'm not a physician. I read research, and I've been doing it for years, first because of what happened to my father, and later because of what happened to me. Nothing I'm about to show you replaces your doctor. What it is the evidence that may not have made it into your last appointment. Nothing I say here is medical advice. What it is the research your doctor may not have had time to read this week. Drop a comment right now with just your age, nothing else. I want to see who's watching, because what I'm about to show you depends on exactly where you are in this. Here is what most people do with chronic fatigue after 60. They accept it. They adjust their expectations downward. They stop taking stairs 2 at a time. They move their longer walks to mornings when they have more energy. They nap after lunch without questioning it. And when they bring it up to their doctor, they hear 9 times out of 10 some version of the same sentence: "That's normal for your age." My father heard that sentence more times than I can count. I want to be precise about something. The doctors who said it weren't lying. They weren't being careless. They were working with a framework that predates the molecular data we now have. The framework said mitochondrial decline is a natural, irreversible feature of aging, that declining energy is expected, that the body simply makes less ATP, less cellular fuel as the decades pass, and that's the end of the story. The research says something more complicated and more useful. What molecular biology has clarified in the last decade is that the decline isn't uniform, isn't inevitable at the rate we assumed, and, critically, is being driven by specific mechanisms that we can now identify and address. The mitochondria, the organelles inside your cells that produce ATP, the energy currency your body runs on, are not just slowing down, they are undergoing a specific type of failure: dysfunction of the mitochondrial membrane. That membrane is what allows the mitochondria to create the electrochemical gradient that drives ATP synthesis. When it becomes compromised, and the research shows it becomes increasingly compromised with age, with oxidative stress, with certain dietary patterns, the mitochondria begin to leak. They consume oxygen without producing the same yield of ATP. And in the process, they release excess reactive oxygen species, what most people call free radicals, into the cell environment. Those free radicals damage surrounding structures. They trigger inflammatory responses, and the cumulative cellular effect, low ATP, high oxidative stress, chronic low-grade inflammation, looks from the outside exactly like depression or exhaustion or, as most doctors will tell you, aging. Nobody told you that fatigue has a cellular address. In my view, and I've read enough of this literature to have one, treating chronic fatigue in adults over 60 as a psychological symptom or an inevitable aging marker when molecular data now shows a specific biological mechanism is one of the largest diagnostic gaps in senior medicine today. Not because the information doesn't exist, because the conversation isn't happening at the pace the research deserves. When did you last feel tired and assume it was just your age? And when was the last time anyone actually looked at what was happening inside your cells? The transition from understanding the gap to understanding the mechanism, that's where this gets actionable. And there is a specific study I want to walk you through, published in Cell Metabolism, tracking mitochondrial biogenesis across aging populations. The numbers in it should change how you think about what you're experiencing. That's where we're going next. The concept at the center of this is called mitochondrial biogenesis. It's the process by which your cells create new mitochondria, and it's regulated primarily by a protein called PGC1 alpha, a master switch for energy metabolism. Here's what the research shows about what happens to that process with age. A 2024 paper in Cell Metabolism examined mitochondrial density and function across 3 age cohorts, adults in their 30s, 50s, and 60s plus. What they found in the over 60 group was not simply fewer mitochondria. It was mitochondria that were functioning at a significantly reduced efficiency, with measurably compromised membrane integrity and elevated reactive oxygen species output. The decline wasn't linear. It accelerated after 60 in ways that suggested feedback loops, not simple wear and tear. Write this down. The cells in the over 60 group weren't just producing less energy, they were producing energy at a cost, burning more fuel per unit of ATP output, releasing more oxidative byproducts in the process, the cellular equivalent of an engine that runs hotter and delivers less. 3 weeks ago, I went back through that paper looking for the specific threshold numbers, and what stood out was not just the efficiency gap, but how early the markers of decline were measurable. The biochemical signature of mitochondrial dysfunction, the elevated 8-OHDG, the mitochondrial DNA deletions, showed up clearly in participants in their early 60s who considered themselves healthy. People who weren't diagnosed with anything. People who were just tired. There's a scenario I think about when I read this research. A woman who used to walk her dog 4 miles every morning, adopted the route slowly, built up to it over years, started stopping at the park bench at the 2-mile mark just to enjoy the view, then the 1-mile mark. Then she started going at 6 in the morning to avoid anyone seeing her stop. And when her internist asked how she was feeling, she said, "Fine. A little tired sometimes," because what else do you say when tired has become your baseline? The research suggests that by the time chronic fatigue becomes that kind of background noise, normalized, explained away, worked around, the mitochondrial markers have often been off-trend for years. Consider what that means for someone who never gets a diagnosis. A retired contractor named David, who spent 30 years on job sites, physically active by default, lifting, climbing, problem-solving under pressure. When he retired at 63, he expected to feel better, more rest, less stress. He started sleeping 9 hours a night. He should have had more energy than ever. Instead, the opposite happened. By his second year of retirement, he described his afternoons as a kind of gray. Not sad, not sick, just unavailable. He would sit in his armchair after lunch, and something would shut off. He would lose an hour, then 2. His internist ran every standard panel. Everything came back in range. "You're doing great for your age," she told him. David started wondering if this was who he had become. The research suggests what David was experiencing had a biological substrate, not a psychological one.
and the markers for it would not have appeared on any of the tests his doctor ran. Has this come up for you or for someone close to you? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Before I get to the part that changes everything, the part that most videos on this topic get completely wrong, I need you to hold what you just heard. Because the standard conversation about this, the supplements, the lifestyle advice, the generic exercise more, sleep better recommendation, is built on an assumption about mitochondria that the data is now complicating, and the complication matters. Here is the assumption that drives most of the generic advice on fatigue after 60, that the mitochondria are simply depleted and the solution is to support them with antioxidants, that more antioxidants means less oxidative damage, which means better mitochondrial function, which means more energy. That assumption is not entirely wrong, but the research has made it significantly more complicated.
Write this down. A 2023 paper in the Journal of Physiology examining cold exposure protocols in adults over 60 found something that challenged how researchers were thinking about ROS and aging. A controlled, brief cold exposure triggered a hormetic response in mitochondria. In other words, the stress of controlled cold activated the very pathways, including PGC1 alpha, that the aging body is underproducing. And here's the counterintuitive part. In the arms of the study that received high-dose antioxidant supplementation alongside the cold exposure, the mitochondrial biogenesis response was blunted. The antioxidants, by clearing the reactive oxygen species before they could act as cellular signals, were interfering with the cell's own repair and renewal mechanism. Let me say this carefully, because I don't want this to be misread. This is not a study that says antioxidants are harmful. It's a study that says the relationship between oxidative stress and mitochondrial health is more nuanced than more protection, less damage. There is a dose, a context, and a mechanism that matters. And most of the advice you'll read about fatigue after 60 doesn't account for this. Now, what about CoQ10 and PQQ? These are the two compounds most frequently discussed in the context of mitochondrial support. And the evidence, when you read it carefully, is more interesting than the supplement industry typically presents it. CoQ10, ubiquinol specifically, is a genuine cofactor in the electron transport chain, the chain that your mitochondria use to generate ATP. The question is not whether it works. In vitro, the mechanism is clear. The question is whether supplementation in adults over 60 produces clinically meaningful outcomes. A double-blind trial published in Nutrients in 2023, 71 adults, average age 68, 12-week protocol, tested CoQ10 combined with PQQ, a compound that appears to have distinct pro-biogenesis activity through the PGC1 alpha pathway. The combination group showed statistically significant improvements in self-reported energy, cognitive clarity, and one functional measure of cardiorespiratory efficiency. The CoQ10-only group showed partial improvements. The control group showed none. The authors are careful, and I'll be careful too. This is a single study, 12 weeks, self-reported primary outcomes. It is not the end of the inquiry, but it is consistent with a mechanistic hypothesis that has grown stronger over several years of research. If your cells are producing less energy per unit of fuel, and that process is being driven by membrane compromise and declining biogenesis, then supporting the cofactors of ATP synthesis alongside the signals for new mitochondria production may address two distinct parts of the problem. If the way your cells are producing energy has been quietly changing for years, would you know? And if you did know, would your current routine be doing anything about it? So where does that leave you? Not with a problem, with a decision. And I'm going to give you exactly 3 things you can bring to your next conversation about energy, fatigue, and cellular health. Let's be clear about what you now know that you didn't know 90 minutes ago.
Your fatigue after 60 is not a psychological event. It is not weakness. It is not inevitable. It has a biological address, the mitochondrial membrane, and a set of upstream regulators, PGC1 alpha, ATP synthesis efficiency, that can be measured, influenced, and in some cases, meaningfully improved. Here are 3 things to act on. The 3 highest impact dietary and lifestyle factors for mitochondrial function after 60, based on what the research consistently identifies, are excess hidden sugar, absence of morning natural light, and sedentarism. Hidden sugar, not the sugar you know about, but the glucose load embedded in processed foods that most people consider normal, chronically elevates insulin, and there is a well-established link between chronic hyperinsulinemia and suppression of PGC1 alpha activity. This is not a debate in the literature. The mechanism is clear. Sustained glucose overload inhibits the very protein your cells need to build new mitochondria. Morning natural light, specifically in the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking, regulates what researchers are calling the circadian mitochondrial rhythm. The mitochondria in your cells cycle through activity and maintenance phases that are tied to light-dark signals. Chronically bypassing that morning light signal, staying indoors, using artificial lighting, working in dark environments, disrupts the timing of mitochondrial function in ways that compound over years.
Sedentarism, the most well-documented saboteur, directly reduces mitochondrial density in skeletal muscle. The reverse is also true. Even moderate movement, particularly resistance-based movement or brisk walking, sustained over time, is one of the most reliably documented activators of PGC1 alpha and mitochondrial biogenesis in the published literature. The cold exposure protocol that showed results in the Journal of Physiology study was not extreme. It was brief, face and forearms exposure to cold water for 2 to 3 minutes, 3 to 4 times per week, not ice baths, not cryochambers, controlled brief thermal stress that activates the mitochondrial stress response. I want to be direct about who this is appropriate for. If you have cardiovascular conditions, hypertension, or any condition your doctor has flagged as a contraindication for thermal stress, this is a conversation to have before you try it, not after. A recommendation is not a verdict. The data is interesting. Your clinical situation matters more than the data. Red light therapy, photobiomodulation, is a category where the mechanistic evidence is genuine and the clinical evidence is still emerging. The proposed mechanism involves cytochrome C oxidase in the mitochondrial electron transport chain, absorbing near-infrared wavelengths and increasing ATP production. The early human data, while limited, is consistent with the mechanism. If you're evaluating this option, the evidence supports the concept more than it supports specific devices or protocols. The question I want you to bring to your next appointment is not, should I take CoQ10? It's a more specific question. Here is the question. Have you considered whether my daily fatigue could be related to mitochondrial function, and would you be open to discussing CoQ10 supplementation as a potential supportive measure? That question does 2 things. It names the mechanism, which signals that you've done some research, and it frames it as a discussion, not a demand. Most physicians respond better to a patient who comes in with a specific, research-grounded question than one who says, "I read online that I should take this." The Nutrients 2023 study used 200 milligrams CoQ10 as ubiquinol, not ubiquinone. Bioavailability matters, combined with 20 milligrams PQQ daily for 12 weeks. That's a reference point for a conversation, not a prescription. Your doctor has context about your full picture that a study cannot. Take these 3 steps to your next appointment, not instead of your doctor, alongside them. That's how this works. You are not a passive recipient of medical decisions. You are an informed participant in your own health. Here is what we covered today.
1. Chronic fatigue after 60 has a cellular mechanism: mitochondrial membrane dysfunction, reduced ATP efficiency, elevated oxidative stress that is now measurable and partially addressable. Normal aging is an explanation. It is not a ceiling. 2. The conventional antioxidant-only approach may be incomplete. Mitochondrial hormesis, controlled stress that activates biogenesis signals, is an emerging framework with meaningful early evidence. The relationship between oxidative stress and cellular renewal is more nuanced than protect everything. 3. CoQ10 combined with PQQ, elimination of the 3 main mitochondrial saboteurs, and brief thermal stress protocols are 3 evidence-informed directions worth discussing with your doctor. If you're walking away from this video differently than you walked in, drop "informed" in the comments. If this is the kind of research you want to keep seeing, the subscribe button is right there. I don't post every day. When I post, it matters. There's one more layer to this that I didn't cover today, and it changes how you interpret everything I just showed you: the connection between mitochondrial function and cognitive clarity after 60. Brain fog, reaction time, word retrieval, these are not separate from what we covered here. They run on the same cellular fuel. That's next. Everything I covered in this video, the mechanisms, the compounds, the protocols, is based on published research. I am not a physician, and nothing here is medical advice. Your clinical situation, your current medications, your cardiovascular and metabolic history, all of it matters, and all of it is something your doctor knows better than any study. I give you the evidence. You and your doctor make the decisions. What's one conversation about your energy levels that you've been putting off, and what would it take to actually have it at your next appointment?